Welcome to the first ever episode of The Fighter with Kris Sims. Yes, I've got my own show now here on Juno News, backed up by True North Wire. Thank you so much for making this a part of your day. If you have not done so yet, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. A little bit about me. So I'm the Alberta Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I've been with the Taxpayers Federation for many years. And prior to that, I was basically in talk radio and in journalism on Parliament Hill for around 20 years or so. I was one of the founding members and reporters of Sun News Network. I was there when we were tearing the plastic off of our brand new monitors, and I was there on the day we were shut down. So it means a lot to me to have you, the audience, be part of this brand new show. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's called The Fighter because in my many, many years of journalism and telling your stories for the hardworking, regular people out there, I would grow in frustration hearing them talk about things like not being able to afford rent, having to borrow money off of friends to cover a utility bill, having to skip meals, never having traveled. And these are working people. These are not people sitting around doing nothing. These are people busting their backsides to try to make ends meet. So I would hear that coming from folks I grew up with in rural British Columbia, rural Western Canada. And then I would work on Parliament Hill. And I would hear journalists, typically, who were part of the Parliamentary Press Gallery, just not get it. They did not understand how hard it was for everyday working people in this country. I also noticed it amongst some politicians. For example, I discovered one day that members of parliament, not all of them, okay, but some members of parliament were still charging what is called a per diem, okay, which is a per day amount that they can charge the taxpayer and get reimbursed for while they were in Ottawa working in the House of Commons. And they were charging them a per diem for like their food, okay, for their meals. Two things. One, members of parliament have apartments with fridges and everything when they're working in Ottawa. But technically, they were outside of their home, which is back in their riding. So they were technically charging this fee. What also really frustrated me is that on most given days when the House of Commons was in session, there were several hot, full meals provided to those members of parliament all the time in the lobbies of the House of Commons. Yet some of these MPs were still dinging taxpayers for their per diem. And it was that stark contrast of talking to people who are just scratching out a living, okay, fighting to keep their head above water. And this is years ago, before Trudeau and before carbon taxes and before inflation, okay? And then on the flip side, seeing where all that money was going in Ottawa. And it became really clear that we have to fight. So at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, one of our slogans is, we are fighting for taxpayers. Darn right we are. So during this show, I want to try to bring you some compelling stories from people telling their experiences. I want to be able to break some news with some newsmakers, and I want to do some more in-depth analysis of the news of the day. Speaking of the news of the day, let's find out what's going on. So Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, as of right now, is in Ottawa. She's going to a Canada Strong and Free event tonight, and she met with Prime Minister Mark Carney briefly yesterday before he jetted off to Washington, D.C. She just finished holding court, okay, at the Parliamentary Press Gallery's interview room. So for folks who've been to Ottawa, right now, actually, the big pointy building, center block with the clock tower in it, that's under massive renovation. Like, people can't go in there unless they're fixing it up. Pretty much everything is happening in what's called West Block, okay? They've got a new House of Commons built over there. There's a big atrium, etc. And off to the side of the House of Commons is a whole wired, mic'd up room that people go into, and they stand in front of a bunch of flags and they speak directly to the Parliamentary Press Gallery. So that is what Alberta Premier Danielle Smith just finished doing. So she was talking about the 9 bad laws. Okay. So things like the energy cap, things like the no more pipelines ban, things like the tanker ban off the West Coast. She was speaking about things like that. And she had a journalist ask her, okay, you are now trying to spearhead a project through Mark Carney's brand new National Projects Office, or whatever that's called, but you're running into a big roadblock, and he's super tall in real life. I think BC Premier David Eby is like 6'6" or 6'7" or something. You're running into a really tall roadblock here, with David Eby saying, you can't have tankers off of my pristine West Coast. And Premier Smith responded to that question. Listen to this.
I think Premier Eby's comments are un-Canadian and they're unconstitutional. I think that the Supreme Court is determined that the reason we have a country and have given trade and commerce power and control over ports and interprovincial infrastructure to the federal government is for exactly this reason, so that a parochial premier isn't able to block nation-building projects. So I think that the courts have been pretty clear on that. And I would hope that Prime Minister Mark Carney would realize it's his obligation to make sure that these kinds of projects get built.
Once again, that was Alberta Premier Danielle Smith just a few minutes ago holding court with the Parliamentary Press Gallery, responding to David Eby, saying that, yeah, we can't have a tanker coming in here off the Northwest Coast. Parochial Premier. That's interesting alliteration. Parochial means narrow in vision or limited in scope. So we're not going to see the end of this back and forth, I think, for a while. Now, what Premier Smith is trying to do here, obviously, is to get Premier David Eby's boot off of Alberta's neck and to get Ottawa's boot off of Alberta's neck. Because, of course, things like the ban on pipelines, okay, the energy cap on our production here in Alberta, the ban on tankers off the West Coast is costing the Canadian economy and Albertans billions of dollars. In fact, economists have estimated that over the last 10 years, so since former Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was elected to power in 2015, they've estimated that between stalled, strangled, or canceled natural resources projects, so this includes mines, okay, based on all of those projects that have either failed or stalled, just not worked, that we have lost out on around $600 billion. That's just through government action or inaction on not getting these resource projects off the ground. That is a staggering amount of money. And it's so big that it's hard to picture. So I'm going to try to help you out here. So 600 billion plus what it's costing us to have our production/emissions cap. If you combine those two amounts, that would cover the costs of the income taxes, the federal income taxes paid by every man, woman, and child in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba for 10 years. That is how much money we are talking about here. That is why we're really struggling with private investors walking away from Canada and not being confident enough to invest here again. Just think of what that could do for roads and bridges and hospitals and schools if we had that kind of money as taxpayers again. Keep this in mind. Nearly 50% of a working person's money now goes to taxes, various levels of taxes, federal, provincial, and municipal, all those fees and levies and stuff. Put another way, imagine your paycheck that arrives, say, every 2 weeks into your bank account. Imagine that amount being almost double. What could you do with that kind of money? Could you afford more nutritious food? Could you pay down some of your debts? Could you maybe save up for a house? Could you afford a more reliable vehicle? That's how much money various levels of government are taking from you. And that is why governance, what is happening in Ottawa with our spending and our budgets, directly affects you. Okay? So, what's going to happen with this upcoming budget in November? We're hearing all sorts of silly buzzwords about assets versus investment versus real spending. And basically, it sounds like they're trying to hide the amount of debt. Is this going to work for them? Let's find out. Joining me now is Federal Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and my good friend, Franco Terrazzano. Franco, you're holding down the fort there in Ottawa, also known as Mordor. I got to pick your brain first right off the top, because now I'm hearing this buzzword of calling spending assets instead of capital. And it's one of those things where if you've ever actually read a budget, it's like you're sitting there watching some kid who isn't really good at artwork, but you're trying to play along with them. Doesn't this just come down to spending, deficits, debt? Isn't this about the math?
Yeah, no, you're right, Kris. And I think you should be worried. So, folks, let me give you the high level what's going on. Okay. So you have the Carney, he's going to change the way the government presents his budget, split one portion, call it operating spending, split it the other portion, calling it capital, investment, assets, all those nice, fun little buzz terms that politicians throw around. But here's the big picture issue. Okay. Trudeau's problem wasn't how he was presenting the budget. Trudeau's problem was that he was wasting your money like crazy and he doubled the debt, right? So Canadians don't need the federal government to change how it presents the budget. Canadians need the federal government to stop wasting our money like crazy, stop overspending, and end their debt-fueled spending spree, right? The real problem is massive spending, massive debt, and the solution is to cut spending, right? Not change what you call spending. Cut it.
Because facts don't care about your feelings. You know, it's one of those things. Going through school, math was always both humbling and empowering. Humbling in the sense that it didn't care if you were upset that you were getting the wrong answer. But once you got the right answer, the light bulb went on. It's like, nice, clean numbers. And this is where I'm kind of scratching my head here, Franco, because Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't just fall off the turnip truck. Like, he's got an economics degree from Oxford. Are you surprised that they're playing buzzword games with this budget? Or maybe is it just that bad and they're just desperately trying to paper it over?
Yeah, I don't know. But look, I remember them attacking the official opposition over slogans. But, what is the biggest slogan of them all? Spend less, invest more, right? That's a slogan. Of course, that's a slogan. But let's get more into the substantive issue here, okay? And look, this could go two ways. Honestly, we'll have to wait till November 4th to see what happens in the actual budget, right? So right now, it's really just speculation. Best case scenario, the government will still be transparent with Canadians and provide the actual deficit number, interest charge number, debt number. Right? So best case scenario, nothing really changes. The bottom line numbers are still there and available for Canadian taxpayers to see. They just talk about, this spending is going here towards the bureaucracy. This spending is going there towards roads. That's the best case scenario, Kris. Now, what I'm worried about is that the Carney government is using this to be less transparent, less accountable to taxpayers, right? Instead of showing how the overall debt is going up, I'm worried, and this could happen, that they tried to bury it and only talk about the day-to-day costs while, ignoring how infrastructure spending, corporate welfare, all that kind of stuff also balloons the debt. Because at the end of the day, if the debt is going up, you did not balance the budget.
Won't that eventually show up in other documents, though? Like, wouldn't that show up in public accounts? Wouldn't that show up in the fiscal year end, at least? Like, where would you have to go hunting with I'm picturing with your miner's helmet on and your pickaxe in your hand? Where would you have to go mining to find that hard number?
Well, that's exactly a great point, because at the end of the day, the actual debt number, how much the government is borrowing and how that's increasing year over year, will come out. Right? It will come out. So at best, the government is giving them, a day, a week's cover, because that number will go out. There's going to be people like us at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation digging through it. There'll be some journalists who'll be digging through it. And then there'll be some academics, I say, that will call the government's bluff. But the problem where it reduces transparency is that it just makes it so much harder for like day-to-day Canadians who have busy lives and have a big time work schedule already, right? Instead of going to one table, seeing the deficit, seeing the debt, seeing the interest charges, it will take more time potentially for Canadians to get that kind of information, right? So that's what I'm really worried about. Like, who knows? Maybe they're just changing it a little bit and you still get the debt number at the end, but the government can really duck accountability and transparency by making these numbers and how our money is being spent a lot harder to find.
Okay, I actually don't know the answer to this question, which are always the most fun ones. Does it matter if the government shifts its regular budget announcements to the fall? Or is it better for us to have them in the spring? Like, does it matter in the world of money?
You know, I don't know. And I'm not exactly against the government producing its budget in the fall. I mean, really, what was going on in the Trudeau era, especially the late Trudeau era, is they kept delaying it anyways, right? It kept getting later and later in the spring, like even after the fiscal year actually started. So, you know, maybe you can make a case that like bring it in the fall is better. At the end of the day, though, again, I don't want us to lose sight of the real issue here, right? The real issue is not how the government presents the budget. The real issue is not what time in the year does the government announce the budget. No, the real issue is that these politicians and government bureaucrats are taking way too much of your money. They're blowing way too much. And we have like a $1.3 trillion debt, folks. That's the real issue, okay? Think about it this way. Interest charges on the debt are costing each Canadian $1,300 this year alone. $1,300, okay? That's not money that's being used to pay down the debt. No. That's not money going to services. That's not money to free up room for tax relief. No, that's $1,300 that the government is taking from each and every Canadian just to pay interest on the debt. Okay, that's the real issue here. The debt-fueled spending spree.
Brutal. Is it still about $1 billion a week we're spending
More
on
than.
debt interest? What?
More than $1 billion a week. Yeah, more than $1 billion a week going to pay debt interest, okay? Government wasting more money paying interest on the debt than what it sends to the provinces in healthcare transfers. Kris, every single dollar you paid in federal sales tax last year, because I know you're in Alberta, no PST, love me Wild Rose country, but every single dollar that you paid in federal sales tax last year went to pay interest on the debt. That is the real issue, not the presentation of the budget, not when the budget comes out. The fact that you are getting soaked because the government is wasting too much of your money.
All right, you're bang on about that. There's something else you were bang on about, and I wanted to bring it up because it really had a bee in my bonnet. There was a headline in the Globe and Mail the other day from a longtime reporter, frankly. So here we are from Campbell Clark. Again, he's been in the game for a long time, for at least 20 years. I think I met him 20-something years ago. So he says, in Poilievre's economics, it's pin the tail on the Liberal donkey. And what he was getting at is he was at the recent press conference that you might have seen where Mr. Poilievre was at one of the church food donation centers in Ottawa. And so he was being flanked by, you know, food bank donations and things like that. And Pierre Poilievre was talking about inflation. And the reporter from the Globe and Mail tried to basically say, oh, well, inflation isn't happening anymore. Basically, why are you still talking about this? All you were talking about before was the carbon taxes. Why are you still talking about inflation? I'm paraphrasing, but it's frustrating, Franco, because frankly, you were right. You were talking about this years ago when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau fired up the printing presses and printed a whole bunch of money out of thin air. And you explained why inflation is a problem. First off, can you please explain to our audience how printing money contributes to inflation?
The more dollars the government prints, the less that your dollars buy. Okay? That is the inflation tax. And this happens when the government central bank, the Bank of Canada, prints new dollars right out of thin air, poof, with a click of a keypad to buy financial assets like government debt, government bonds. Okay? That is the inflation tax. And why do prices rise? Well, look, the government, through the central bank, can print new dollars right out of thin air. But you can't print up new farmland, you cannot print up gasoline, and you sure can't print groceries out of thin air. So what you had was the government during the pandemic having its printing press running on overdrive, where the Bank of Canada at the heart of the pandemic printed up more than $300 billion and then dumped it into an economy facing years of revolving government lockdowns. So the government created the perfect storm for inflation, created up a bunch of new dollars out of thin air to finance Ottawa's deficits, but then also shut down our economy. Okay? Too many dollars chasing too few goods. That's the inflation tax, and you're paying the price.
Can you explain why prices have not gone down? Because I often hear in the mainstream media and you've explained this to me before, picking up Franco from the airport's the best thing because you get an economics lesson for free. It's great. So you've explained this to me before. Can you explain why prices have not gone down if inflation is slowing down? It's not gone, it's slowing down. Explain that.
Okay, so when you see a lot of the reporters and let's just say what it is, the mainstream media, the legacy media, whatever you want to call it, when they report that inflation is cooling, inflation is coming down, well, it's kind of just a statistical trick because inflation is just year over year price increases, right? So look, after a 40-year high inflation in 2022, this statistic will make it look like inflation is going down, but that's not what's happening, right? Prices are still going up. They're just not rising as fast as they were when inflation was a 40-year high. So think about it this way, folks. You know, I love chips, I love beer, I love pizza after a good night out. Let's say I put on 100 pounds in 1 year. Okay, that's bad. I put on 100 pounds. Then I put on 50 pounds the year after that. Then I add 3 pounds the year after that. So in 3 years, I gained 153 pounds. I'm still gaining weight. Yes, I gained a little bit less weight, but am I actually losing fat? No, I'm still putting on the extra fluff just a little bit slower than before. That's what's happening now.
So we're still in that bad inflation moment where we're all the way out here, okay, putting on 153 pounds. We're just gaining weight slower. The problem is we're still obese. So newbie question, because I don't have my economics degree. Is there a way to sop up some of that money? Is there a way to reverse that damage and actually have deflation or uninflation? I'm not sure what you call it, and actually see prices go down. Have we seen that before in the West?
Yeah, well, we have. Look, there's first I would have to say there's let's say 4 ways that the government causes inflation. Okay, so number 1 is taxes, right? Like take half your paycheck, folks, rip it in half, because essentially that half is the tax man's, right? When you look at all the different taxes that your family pays to all levels of government, it's almost 50% of your budget. The average Canadian family's budget, that's going to taxes. So, hey, you want to make all areas of life more expensive? Stop taking so much, all right?
Right.
That's a message to government. The second thing is that you also have taxes that are directly inflationary, like the carbon taxes. Make it more expensive for you to drive to work, more expensive for you to heat your home, and more expensive for you to fill your fridge, right? Remove those types of taxes. We're still paying carbon taxes here in Canada. The third way is the inflation tax, right? Where the central bank prints up new dollars out of thin air, largely to finance massive deficits in Ottawa. So one thing that these politicians can do is stop running these massive deficits, right? Cut spending. And finally is, I said too many dollars chasing too few goods, right? So you need less new dollars, less new fiat dollars, and you need more of the stuff that money buys. So that means governments getting out of the way, Ottawa getting out of the way, and allowing job creators to actually invest in and build these major natural resource projects.
So that would actually help. So I have to ask you, are you confident that this can happen? Because I must say, every time I go out shopping now, I'm still noticing it. Like prices, are high prices here to stay, or can we chip away at this with some smart governing?
Well, we can. Whether or not we will, I don't know, right? And again, I'll go back to November 4th. That's the thing I'm looking at is the budget. Because you hear some people talking about, oh, the Carney government spending review. They're going to look at this. They're going to look at that. But like until I actually see the numbers where there's actual spending going down, then the budgeting is a failure, right? Like, look, what's the old saying? Like, what? Fool me once, shame on you. Well, fool me, what, 27 times? Then it's probably shame on me, right? We've heard this government, especially the Trudeau government, year after year after year, say they're looking for savings, saying they're doing a spending review. And then what happens? Well, they spend billions of dollars more. Hey, pro tip for the politicians watching, if you're increasing spending by billions of dollars every single year, you're saving money wrong.
Awesome. Lastly, before I let you go here, Franco, can you point to a couple of things that the government could cut tomorrow? Like walking fresh out of the building, he's standing on Wellington, he's looking around. What could he cut tomorrow that would save us money?
Well, I don't know the first thing about farming, but I'm pretty sure my buddies back in Brooks know how to build a barn for a lot less than $8 million. So hey, maybe don't spend $8 million building a barn on the Governor General's estate, right? There's so many crazy examples of silly waste, like the government spending $100,000 to study the birth, life, and death of a grocery cart. Crazy, right? Maybe just call Bubbles from Trailer Park Boys, offer him a stick of pepperoni, and there you go. But let's look at the big items, right? Number one, corporate welfare. Okay, corporate welfare costs taxpayers about $11 billion a year. So they take your money, then they give it to select multinational corporations. Well, let's do the math on that. It means corporate welfare costs your family of four $1,100 a year. Cut it, get rid of it. And finally, the other big area here is the bureaucracy, right? The government added about 100,000 extra federal paper pushers and ballooned the cost of the bureaucracy 77% since 2016.
Astonishing. Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Hey, thanks, Kris. This was fun.
You bet. Once again, that was Franco Terrazzano. You can check out a lot of his articles where he talks about this stuff at length. He doesn't like to talk about it, but he's got his degree in economics and he explains stuff very thoroughly. So if you head on over to our website, taxpayer.com, you can search through his name and you can read a whole bunch of his analysis on this stuff. Okay, we're going to shift gears here to Alberta, and we have got one of the biggest government union strikes and fights going on that we have seen in a generation. The Alberta Teachers Union is on strike. It's on strike for the first time in 23 years. Now, here's the thing. One, even if you don't live in Alberta, you should still pay attention to this, because once one big government union goes on strike, chances are another big government union in another province thinks that that's a smart thing to do. And it's definitely not a good thing for taxpayers. The other element here in Alberta is you'd think that with a deal rejection vote of 89.5% and the teachers going on strike for the first time in 23 years, that the deal that was offered by Alberta Premier Danielle Smith must have been terrible. And coming from her government, it must have been terrible. But that's not true. The Danielle Smith government was offering teachers more money. They were offering a pay increase of 12% over 4 years, so 3% per year. They had also offered to hire 3,000 brand new teachers, plus 1,500 new classroom assistants. So this is where people are left scratching their heads, where this would have been, according to Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, the highest wage increase offered in years. And if they had accepted this deal, it would have made Alberta teachers the highest paid in Western Canada. So now we're hearing from teachers saying things like, oh, well, it's not about the money. Okay, well, you rejected the deal by almost 90%. So I think this gets down to a bigger question. What is going on? How can we dive in to our education systems and fix it so that students are getting very good outcomes, they love learning, and they like being able to go to school, and teachers are getting good results without throwing more money at the problem? How do we fix this smarter? Let's find out. Joining me now is my very good friend and the Associate Director of Education Policy at the Fraser Institute, Paige MacPherson, and one of my old Sun News Network colleagues. So I'm super happy to have you on the first show.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kris. I'm so happy to be here too.
And we actually have something super important to talk about. Usually Paige and I are trying to fix the world, but let's fix the world of education here in Alberta in particular. So you've probably been following the play-by-play here, Paige. The story goes that the Alberta teachers rejected a deal offer by close to 90%, saying no, that would have otherwise made them the highest paid teachers in Western Canada. So, and the offer was substantial and generous. So a lot of people are scratching their heads saying, what on earth is going on here? Now, to be fair, we are hearing from some teachers saying it's not about the money. It's about things like classroom complexity and things are too complicated in their classrooms. And we're also hearing a lot of politics. There's plenty of agitators within the Alberta Teachers Union that don't like Premier Smith. So where do we go from here? How can we actually change and fix how we do school in Canada that would save us money?
Right. So one thing that it's really important to keep in mind whenever we have, especially the context of a teacher strike, is that the most important stakeholder in education are the students, right? So ensuring that we have a system that prioritizes student achievement, academic success, and something that ideally meets the needs, the unique needs of every student in some way. So as you said, we can get a system where students actually enjoy going to school and their outcomes are good. That needs to underpin everything and be the priority. So with that in mind, maybe we can first talk about what exactly do they mean by classroom complexity, because I do think this is a really significant issue. It's not unique to Alberta, but it is something that is very real and is a very legitimate concern that teachers have. So I'll quote the union here, the teachers union, the Alberta Teachers Association, which polls their members, teachers, on some of these issues. 93% of teachers report encountering some form of aggression or violence at school, most often from students. This is in Alberta. And additionally, 85% of unionized teachers are dealing with an increase in cognitive, social, emotional, and behavioral issues in their classroom. So what this means is that we've got a real discipline issue in schools, in government public schools in Alberta, and also that the classroom is full of a very diverse range of kids that have a diverse range of needs. So those might be some of those behavioral problems. It might be severe learning disabilities. It might be some form of the autism spectrum disorder. It might be a whole range of things that are making it very challenging to teach this wide range of kids in a classroom. Recall a few years ago, many years ago now, when we were on Sun News Network together, it made headlines that there was a teacher in an Alberta government public school, actually, that refused to not give an F on an assignment, refused to not fail a student. I don't know if you remember this happening.
I do.
But we've moved so far beyond that now, where kids are essentially, and this is, again, not unique to Alberta, this is right across the country, they're really passed through. And what that means is that a lot of kids are really not meeting those academic outcomes that they should be, and yet they're advancing to the next grade. And that adds another level of complexity for teachers. On top of that, in 2020, 1/4 of the students in Edmonton government public schools were just learning English, were English language learners. And think about, since 2020, how immigration to Canada and Alberta specifically has really exploded since then. So you can imagine how many students in the class are also just learning the language. And what that means is that you have in the words of, the current sort of edu babble, a complex classroom. You have a lot of different kids. And so that is a challenge, a legitimate challenge for teachers. Now, the issue is that paying teachers more, pouring ever more money into the government public school system, and even reducing class size is unlikely to solve that issue of the complex classrooms. That really is the root issue here. And that's where, you get to a real impasse in terms of what the current sort of rhetoric is around for solutions and what those solutions might actually be. And I can talk a little bit more about why those things are probably not going to solve the problem and what might solve the problem. But I think that's just a critical, foundational point of understanding, is that classroom complexity.
Okay, just very quickly on the numbers. I've gone back through them several years. Spending on education continues to go up. So if you're hearing from the Alberta Teachers Union bosses who are saying, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is slashing funding to education, that's not true. Like, anybody can go to the budget, anybody can look it up under the line item, just straight up capital E education, not advanced education, and they can see that number is steadily increasing year over year over year. And I really appreciate your frankness and your candor on this, because I am frankly hearing privately from teachers who are like, hey, we love your show, we follow things really closely, or even, we're supporters of the Taxpayers Federation, but this is what's happening in classroom. Teachers seem hesitant to voice this directly. Are they worried about being seen as mean or uncaring or something towards kids who have special needs, who have serious behavioral issues, who perhaps can't speak English, and so it's really slowing them down and being able to teach their kids? Is there a hesitancy coming from teachers to just spit it out and say what's exactly wrong?
I think that obviously I can't speak for teachers, but I think there is a hesitancy here where you've got a lot of stakeholders in this issue that care a lot about how kids are doing, parents, other students themselves, teachers, administrators. There's people who care a lot. They want all students to get a good education. And that has to include students that have that wide range of needs, even if the student is, throwing desks across the classroom because they have these severe behavioral issues. That student deserves an education as well. The challenge is that you've got in government public schools a one-size-fits-all model. And I'll just add as well that Alberta is also grappling with the challenge of exploding enrollment. Part of that is the immigration piece. And part of that is just that Alberta is a young province in terms of demographics. And so you do have this increasing enrollment in government public schools. And so while you're absolutely right that the nominal spending is going up, they are spending more year over year on education. You do have the increasing enrollment to go with that. And so that's creating a challenge as well. The question is, if you're going to find your solutions in government public schools, with only unionized teachers, is government moving fast enough? Are they delivering solutions? Is the solution more one size fits all classroom and then pouring more resources into that classroom? I would say that, the evidence just shows that it's probably not going to solve that problem of classroom complexity.
How do we fix this? You and I talk a lot about charter schools. It was one of my favorite conversations when I was planning to move to Alberta because, we homeschooled our kids. We were very careful with what schools we were trying to put them into. But frankly, there wasn't a lot of school choice where we were living rurally in British Columbia. And then I was thrilled to move to Alberta, where there is more choice in the sense between regular public and the Catholic system. And there's so many charter schools here. Can you explain for the rest of Canada, or even some people in Alberta who don't know, how the charter school system works in Alberta? How does funding follow the student, and how does that work for a lot of families?
Sure. So essentially what the government does is they take a percentage of the per student funding equivalent that would be going to their local government public school if a child was to attend that school. And instead they can redirect that to either an independent school at a percentage. So not the full amount that would have gone if they would have gone to a government public school, but a percentage of that, up to 70%. Or they can direct it to a charter school, which again is typically or traditionally has been a lower cost option, at least for the taxpayer, for government, but is fully funded for parents in terms of tuition. So parents do not pay any upfront tuition to go to this type of a charter school. And then there is a little bit of funding made available for homeschool families as well in Alberta. And so essentially what it means, this system of school choice that exists in Alberta, and although charter schools in particular are unique to Alberta, school choice is not unique. 5 out of 10 provinces do have a similar system of basically a portion of parents' tax dollars following their child to the school of their choice. But what's unique about Alberta is the charter schools. So charter schools are essentially, they're schools that are autonomous. They're not operated by a government public school board. They do not have to hire unionized teachers in Alberta, but they do have to teach the curriculum. They are nonprofit. They are non-religious schools, but they have a unique charter, a unique reason for operating. And essentially, if they have a reason that is different than what the local government public school offers, a group of educators, parents, teachers within a community can start up their own school, a charter school. And there's lots of interesting examples of this in Alberta. They've got STEM charter schools, classical charter schools. You've got schools that specifically are targeted toward disadvantaged populations as students who've experienced trauma. There's our Indigenous culture-focused charter schools. There's English second language charter schools. There's rural stewardship charter schools, which are in rural communities where you might have a shrinking population in government public schools, and they're really celebrating that rural life and making that part of their education. So it's a really unique model in that there's very low barrier to entry for families because there's no tuition, and it can be catered. And this is where I think it kind of, circles back to what we were talking about in terms of the complex needs in a classroom. You've got different types of kids and different types of learners. You're trying to cram them all into one size fits all classrooms, and it's really not working well. It's a real challenge for teachers. and it's a challenge for other students in the classroom as well, and parents. So if you can have a model that instead celebrates those learners and creates environments that are better for them, whether that's through an independent school model or through a charter school, then perhaps you're solving some of these problems by empowering families to make those choices.
Do you think that that is something the Alberta government would be able to sell to the average person? Like, do you think the average person understands exactly what you just described there, which sounds like a pretty smart way to solve some of these problems, frankly? Do you think that that will be understood by the average person in Alberta enough for the government to have the courage to do something that bold?
Well, the vast majority of students in Alberta still do attend government public schools. And
Yeah.
one thing that's been unique and interesting and studied about the school choice in Alberta is that, particularly in Edmonton, where research showed that it actually improved the results of the government public schools by having this level of choice. So everybody kind of, the rising tide lifts all boats. Everybody really benefited from this. So that's a great option for a lot of families. But the charter school option or the independent school option is just not made available to every family. So typically at an independent school, you still need to pay some level of tuition as a parent. And at a charter school, I mean, their wait lists, you hear from charter schools, they say it, publicly all the time, that their wait lists far exceed what they can provide. And they'd love to expand, but there are these barriers that are in place preventing them from doing so. So I think there are already quite a lot of people in the public who would like to be able to take advantage of these options. And so the question is, policy-wise, if the government wanted to make it easier to expand charter schools, listen to the leaders that are running these charter schools now and make it a more accessible option. If they wanted to do more to make independent schools a more viable option, there are jurisdictions like, for example, in Australia, where they target low-income family funding for independent school tuition. So based on your postal code, you actually have a higher level of funding to attend an independent school. And there's lots of families in Alberta that would be able to benefit from something like that, but they can't, even with the existing subsidy, the existing amount of their tax dollars that are following their child to the school of their choice, they still aren't able to make that a reality for their family. So helping more families do that could alleviate some of the pressure on the government public school classrooms. And especially if those schools, I think, were targeted towards those diverse learners that already exist in Alberta. There are lots of special needs private schools that exist, and charter schools that I said, do target disadvantaged kids, but there's a lot more opportunity there. So I can't really comment on the politics, but it's also
Sure.
about doing what's right and doing what will actually work and what is backed by evidence, because we know that in provinces where there is a higher level of per student funding in government public schools, the results are not better. Alberta is outperforming those provinces. So that's not the answer. We also know that the research on smaller class sizes, there's a small benefit in the early grades, but beyond the very early grades, there's really no measurable impact in terms of how students perform improved outcomes. So some of these solutions, they don't solve the problem. So perhaps government getting out of the way and allowing some of these community driven solutions to take place, that really might be the answer.
So just quickly to recap on what you just pointed out there about class size, we hear a lot about class size, but when you dovetail that back to what we started this conversation about, is if you're a teacher and you're dealing with maybe, 6 or 8 kids who just can't, keep up, and like they're constantly trying to have to deal with behavioral issues, I can see, frankly, that classroom size might be an issue. Are they
Mm-hmm.
using the term classroom size as a way of just trying to deal with this problem, but not actually say it out loud? My point is if you've got like a really good math class and everybody's keeping up, I don't think it would really matter at the high school level if there's 40 kids in there, if they're all just keeping up and able to do that. I think
Yeah.
the issue probably gets to be when you have a whole bunch of students that do have really challenging needs. I think that's where you're running into the classroom complexity combined with big class sizes, right?
That's right. So it's just, you're not getting to the root issue.
Yeah.
I can totally understand how having a smaller class, if your class has all of these challenges in it, it would be easier to stay afloat. But but it doesn't address the root issue. We know from the research that some of the highest performers on the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA tests, are they have some of the largest class sizes. So Singapore, South Korea, they are outperforming Canada. They have larger class sizes than Canada on average. That doesn't solve the problem. And again, in terms of the research on Western jurisdictions where you've got this, there are the small benefits in the earlier grades, but once you get beyond that, you're really just not seeing the benefit in terms of student achievement from reducing those class sizes. However, it's an extremely costly intervention. To reduce class sizes is a very expensive thing to do. So the question then, if you're the government, where can I spend my money best? That's a very costly intervention. The other thing that I would say, because where I live in Nova Scotia, there are more strictly enforced class caps than in Alberta. Now, we don't have the same enrollment challenges that Alberta has with that growing enrollment, but just one thing that I'll note is that embedded into the policy on these strictly enforced class caps in Nova Scotia is the ability to create more split classes. So a 2-3 split, 3-4 split, whatever it might be. Tell me that doesn't add to classroom complexity, because you're now having to teach two different curricula to two different sets of learners, and the students are only able to learn their grade level curriculum half the time.
Yeah.
So that's not to say, of course, there's split classes everywhere. But this is just sort of the pressure release valve that's sort of built into the class caps in Nova Scotia. So all of that is just to say that these policies, they're not a silver bullet for improving education. They're really not rooted in evidence, but also they have unintended consequences that need to be considered.
Paige MacPherson, I wanted to get your quick thoughts, shifting gears from education as we say goodbye for this show. Bari Weiss, who we're both big fans of, and I know you listen to her. She, of course, was with the Free Press for a long time. And I'm bringing this up for a very good reason, because we're here on Juno News. We were together on Sun News Network. We think that independent free press journalism is vital, right? If I can speak for myself, here in Canada. I just wanted to get your quick thoughts on her moving over to CBS. Is this giving you some hope that there's going to be stronger, more independent free press?
Well, one thing that I think that it really shows is that there is that demand for that sort of independent, thoughtful journalism. Something that I really appreciate about the Free Press is that they do some of these deep dives in the age of social media where you see these really quick headlines. I think they're giving often controversial, but really thoughtful analysis on very important issues of the day. And so the fact that she is, that there's this deal happening with CBS, to me, it just shows that, wow, there is clearly the demand for that independent-minded journalism out there. We'll have to see how it goes with, I'm really hoping that the quality remains with the Free Press, because I do really appreciate that outlet. But I think it is, here in Canada, it's a bit of a perhaps a tale for us to learn from, because okay, clearly this demand for this independent, thoughtful journalism exists, and it's not fringe; it's actually quite mainstream.
Let's mainstream a free press again. Thank you so much, Paige MacPherson. She is the Associate Director of Education Policy at the Fraser Institute.
Thank you.
Folks, we mean it. If we can mainstream a free press again, we are all going to be better. Because frankly, I think the latest number that I saw was more than 60% of Canadians now think that journalists are deliberately trying to mislead them with statements they know to be false. That means that there is next to no trust left in mainstream journalism. And when that happens, things start having the wheels fall off. It means so much to us that you watch this show. I hope you like this brand new show here, The Fighter with Kris Sims on Juno News. Be sure to leave a comment underneath this video. And if you haven't done so yet, head on over to Juno News and subscribe, because that is the way that we're able to fight for you.